Okay, this is yet another lecture in our History 2301 class. This is Professor Kahan Lust. This lecture is entitled The Europeanization, excuse me, and Texas. Now, before we get into Texas, quote specifically, in 1527, King Charles I of Spain appointed an explorer named Panfilo de Narvaez as governor of the vast unknown territory between Florida and the River of Palms, which was a ballpark about 150 miles north of the present-day Rio Grande River Valley. Narvaez was authorized, to conquer the land that he found and the natives, as well as to settle and administer any areas brought under his control. This Narvaez expedition was a spectacular disaster. After stranding themselves in Florida without their ships, Narvaez and his men built some small boats in which they were going to attempt to basically kind of skirt the Gulf Coast all the way around and into a place called Panuca. However, they ended up shipwrecked on the Texas coast, and where they wound up actually landing in Texas was present-day Galveston. As it played out, only 4 of the castaways managed to return to Spanish civilization. These men spent 7 years with the natives of present-day Texas. They trekked across hundreds of miles on foot. One of these supposed 4 ragged castaways was Narvaez's second in command, a guy named Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. He had been kidnapped, enslaved, and he and the other 3 made it to present-day Mexico City. So they did wind up back in the hands of Spanish colonial administration. Vaca ended up making a report back to Spain about what he saw and described the peoples, the animals, the way of life of all of these people that he found. Now, he was absolutely writing all of this with an audience in mind. It was just this spectacularly wild account. It made the Spanish look like victims. It put said that the Native Americans were incredibly evil and had performed all of these sort of horrible things or visited all of these horrible things on the Spanish. In a final insult in all of this stuff, Vaca actually told the Native Americans who guided him to the Spanish outpost that they would be safe, that he would vouch for them and make sure that they were never attacked. Vaca then essentially watched the Spanish ride out to go out and kill these people. So it wound up being a horrific circumstance. Now, given the way Vaca actually wrote his report, the Spanish themselves had some really big questions about this whole thing and really didn't buy all of the stuff that Vaca was telling them. So they sent out a new investigation, a new incursion, because they wanted something along the lines of what we might today refer to as independent verification. They sent a friar named Marcos de Niza to check all of this stuff out. Now, in order to guide him, Niza took a former slave named Estevanico, the guy pictured on the left-hand side at the top on the screen. Estevanico had actually accompanied Cabeza de Vaca, so he was one of the, quote, 4 ragged survivors. And I'm telling you about Niza mostly for only one reason. I'm sure you've all heard of things such as the Spanish sought gold and they were looking for silver on a sort of never-ending quest. And the reason is that they had heard tales of literal cities of gold and silver because Niza made it to a Pueblo village that was carved into quartz, okay, and believed that he had found a city of gold and a city of silver. This city that was carved into quartz was the genesis of these sort of ridiculous stories, and it opened the floodgates to expedition after expedition after expedition to try to discover the abundant wealth of these areas. In the immediate aftermath of Niza's expedition, the Viceroy of New Spain assigned a man named Francisco Vasquez de Coronado to continue looking for, quote, El Dorado, the city of gold. Coronado and subsequent explorers trekked the Great Plains across much of what we today refer to as the Panhandle region. However, when they made it to the same places that Nisa wrote about, they obviously determined that Nisa was wrong about the gold and silver. Now, to be clear, this is not to say that there wasn't an enormous amount of gold and silver in the New World holdings of Spain. This is not to say that guys like Coronado didn't find gold and silver. They did. But what they were not finding were places where the buildings were made out of city of gold, that the cities themselves were not made of gold. They found lots of gold and silver, but just not cities of gold. Now, while other explorers headed north into the Great Plains, Hernando de Soto set out on yet another expedition out of Florida with the idea of finding the same golden cities through present-day Alabama and the Mississippi Valley. When de Soto died and another explorer named Luis de Moscosos de Alvarado took control, ultimately the party abandoned its search for a westward in favor of a westward turn with their goal of finding Mexico City. In doing so, this expedition wound up entering East Texas and went as far west as the Trinity River. But this was the extent of their trip. Moscoso turned around angry and wrote such an angry and bleak letter to the Spanish government, basically saying, "There's nothing here. This is just bleh." It was so bleak that many Spanish looked at Texas and said, "We don't want anything to do with this place. There's nothing reasonable here. There's no reason to even go into Texas." Now, by the time we hit the 17th century, Spain is facing some serious competition from other European powers, hence the map that you see on the screen. And what they're facing is competition for control of the so-called New World. The Dutch controlled the Hudson River Valley, basically around present-day New York. The Dutch ultimately ceded all of their holdings to the English. The French founded a colony called Quebec and used that colony in order to push southward to Nova Scotia and westward into the Great Lakes region. Now, today we think of Quebec as just this one region north of present-day Detroit. But understand that all of this stuff here that I'm circling with this pointer, all of this is the French colony of Quebec, which is why I say they're moving southward into Nova Scotia. They're moving westward into the Great Lakes region with the idea of they're going to use these places as colonial bases. Now, the real competition in all of this for the Spanish were the English. By the 1640s, if you just look at this map, virtually everything between present-day New England all the way down to northern Florida belonged to the English. And what the English sought was expansion to the west, so taking their territorial holdings and moving out further west. Something that would take them into areas that were controlled by the Spanish. So it looks like as they're doing this, they are going to just necessarily bump into the Spanish. They're going to come into contact with the Spanish. Now, the Spanish had actually set up a pretty efficient system in all of this stuff. In their whole administration of the New World. The king was an autocrat, meaning that the king is the guy. He's the ruler. He says, "I'm the king, and this is how it goes." So the king is the autocrat. He passed his orders directly to a political bureaucracy in present-day, quote, Mexico, or New Spain, as it was called at this point, that was established in the time of the Aztecs. So it was pretty long-standing, even during this particular era. The bureaucrats were directly appointed by the king, and they had control of the day-to-day affairs and implemented policy in New Spain. but it's fair to point out that while they were in control and they did the day-to-day stuff, um, there's a huge amount of difference in terms, excuse me, a huge amount of distance between, quote, New Spain and the Spanish government. The Spanish government are actually all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. So the Atlantic is the big dividing line here. Okay, and it allows for some semblance of molding of policy by these bureaucrats to fit the local standards, because the king is not going to get on a boat and go all the way across the Atlantic to ask the viceroy of New Spain, what the heck are you doing over here? Okay, so the Atlantic provides a pretty good buffer, if you will. Whatever these kings did, and whatever the provincial governors did in administering all of this stuff in New Spain, the first order of the day, if you will, was order. Everything needed to proceed in a proficient fashion, that was laid out. It was prescribed. It was not going to be a chaotic expansion into the New World. And the Spanish are going to use a number of agencies or institutions to guide the process along. Okay. Now, the first institution established was the military garrison and fort, or the presidio. Okay. The Spanish started using these in the last half of the 1500s against Native Americans in present-day Mexico. A governor would be in place of a region, and then a chain of presidios established with a commander at each one of these provisions. So the appointment of provisional governor was important, because the provisional governor would then say, this is where the presidios are actually going to be. Now, the presidio was really important. It was a place for prisoners to complete sentences, so there's kind of a prison element to it. It also provides a walled space for negotiations to happen between different groups of people. Its most important function, the most important function of the presidio, was it's the place where soldiers trained and equipped themselves, and their base of operations for protecting the other big institution of the era, the missions, okay, and the friars that were associated with these missions, because pacifying and controlling the Indians who lived in the West was the other part of the bigger plan here. Okay. Now, since I mentioned the missions are the second of these institutions. The use of missions had actually begun in Spain. It didn't start in the New World. It started back in Spain during a period called the Reconquista, which was when the Spanish Catholics retook control of Spain from what was called Moorish rule. During that Reconquista, Catholic friars would try to convert Muslims in Spain ahead of fighting, saying that if we can convert enough of these people, we don't have to actually have a fight. So by the 1580s, priests of several Catholic orders, most prominently the Franciscan and Dominicans, established and staffed missions both in Spain and in the New World, and they carried out a number of different functions in the New World. First and most important one was conversion. They sought primarily to convert the indigenous populations. That is always job one for the missions. Okay. However, the missions were also considered important in establishing friendly relations with quote unquote hostile groups. And the crown considered the missions responsible for retaining control on conquered areas. Now, that's kind of an odd thing to think, to kind of wrap your head around, that the missions are the ones, not the presidios, the missions are the ones responsible for retaining control in the conquered areas. The next institution is the civilian settlement, and this is absolutely an institution in and of itself. It's again a holdover from the Reconquista. The plan is you conquer a territory, you send in a bunch of civilians into an area to populate, or in some case, repopulate an area, to integrate Spanish traditions and customs into the region, and then, of course, also to exploit the resources in that region so that the kingdom got the wealth that it sought in colonization. The kings of Europe and the rulers of Europe were not in the game of colonization just for prestige. The whole point was we're here to make money. Okay, so the civilian layout is going to be the important part of all of this. Now, the town had a very specific plat or layout. It was square, and it included rectangular plazas. Okay, the main plaza being the town center, with streets that, as you can see on this schematic on the screen, all of the streets cross at right angles across the entire city or the entire layout. The eastern side of the settlement was designated for church buildings, while the western side of the settlement was designated for government and political units for political use. This again is all by design. It's not happening accidentally. They're not falling, as the phrase goes, bass-ackwards into this. Okay, the layout took advantage of nature, using morning light for masses and rituals and church operations. And then as the sun traveled, it would allow government officials to work later into the afternoon sun. Okay, officials allocated lots for residents along the streets oriented south, east, and west. Officials designated the areas surrounding the town as public property for all residents to use to grow crops or raise livestock. So there's a sense of communal understanding of property ownership here. Regulations governing site selection based on sanitation needs, access to food or resources, and proximity to Indians were all put in place at the plot level. Settlers or pobladores were expected to obey the laws laid out by Spanish officials, although, again, contingencies did exist, and contingencies sometimes compelled people to disobey the law. Now, finally, the last of the institutions, the Spanish employed ranchos or ranches. Livestock farmers, again, played an enormous role on the frontier, even if in some cases it's only quote unquote, a support role in Christianizing and defense. The rancheros, the people who worked those ranches, the rancheros provided beef, pork, tallow, hide, all sorts of other animal byproducts to the individual towns. As far as the missions were concerned, the rancheros helped keep converted Indians from leaving the missions in search of wild game. Essentially, the goal of the rancheros, or the job of the rancheros, is not just to provide all of this stuff, but show the Native Americans who converted that there's a new career path for them. They don't have to live the same way Native Americans had always lived. They can follow this path. They also helped soldiers of the presidios as well by furnishing live animals for work at the presidio, and on more than one occasion pitching in on expeditions when needed. Now, the point here, again, I know I'm going to overemphasize this to the point of it being tiresome. It's not chaotic expansion. It's orderly. There's a process, and it helps, or at least in theory, having it be an orderly process helps create an efficient bureaucratic structure so that when faced with competition by, say, the English or the French, these areas that the English and the French are going to encroach in, they're already Spanish, no matter what the French or the English might try to do. But the reality of Spanish civilization and Spanish settlement in these regions is this: their strongest and first competition in colonizing Texas, no matter what their fears were of what the English might do or what the French might do, their first challenge and their strongest challenge comes from Native Americans. Native Americans were the powerhouse in Texas, even as late as the end of the 1600s and heading into the 1700s. Native Americans had political control of most of the land in Texas. They had economic control. They had demographic control. So much so that most Indians thought of other Indians as their competition. All of the Native Americans are competing with one another for the same resources and materials via trade, for control of trade routes, even for political dominion over other Native American groups. So when they looked at the Spanish and they thought, if you will, of the Spanish are simply one among many different groups vying for control here. Right? Let's head into West Texas real quick. Germano Indians had been trading with a group of Native Americans called the Pueblos in New Mexico, and at first they were among the first groups that encountered the Spanish. In 1629, the Pueblos and the Germanos asked the Spanish to come to their lands and teach them the Catholic religion, which they said had been introduced by the so-called Lady in Blue. Now, the Lady in Blue depicted on the screen at the bottom left of the screen was said to be a Spanish nun, Madre Maria de Agreda. And supposedly she visited Native Americans via a miracle, or what the church called spiritual bilocation, meaning she was in two places at once. Regardless of what happened or how it happened, the Spanish expedition proceeded into these areas under a Spanish friar named Father Juan de Salas, and undertook yet another expedition in 1632. West Texas held a lot of things for the Spanish. It's not just about souls to be saved. Okay, there were freshwater pearls in the Colorado River tributaries. There were countless buffalo in Texas, in West Texas. And also, from a strategic standpoint, Germano territory could be used as a jumping off point for trade with the Caddo. So the Spanish are unable to establish any real presence, though, until about 1680. However, the control, or the presence, if you will, is kind of short-lived because of something called the Pueblo Revolt or the Pueblo Rebellion. Now, the Pueblo Revolt or Pueblo Rebellion is not 100% a thing that's related to Texas history. It's more about New Mexico's history. But just as a quick aside, the Pueblo Rebellion was a revolt against, or by the Pueblo, against Spanish rule in 1680. It was led by a Pueblos religious leader named Pope against the brutality of Spanish rule. There had been a drought that hit New Mexico, and settlements of both the Spanish and the Pueblo got attacked by Apache Indians as a result. So when this happened, the Pueblo started turning to traditional religious ideals, basically because they believed that the Catholic Church had let them down. If you remember when I talked about this stuff in the first lecture or the second lecture, about the peopling of Texas and the Native American groups, their understanding of nature was very simple. You live with nature. You don't use nature. You are a partner with nature. So if they've done something wrong to offend nature, they get punished. So the revolt, Pope's rebellion or the Pueblo rebellion, is inherently about this idea that we have offended the gods, so we've got to come back to our old ways. Okay. Now, the governor of New Mexico, of the New Mexico region, responded by ordering executions of quote-unquote medicine men and Pueblo leaders. So the rebellion is about pushing the Spanish out because they've become too draconian. Now, it successfully kicks the Spanish out of what is present-day New Mexico in 1680, but the Spanish are going to return in the 1690s with promises of a far less aggressive government and a far less aggressive church. Now, in 1683 and 1684, the Spanish who fled Pueblo took up residence in present-day El Paso, site of a Franciscan mission, the San Clemente mission. There were a number of Humano who were living at this mission. Their leader was a guy named Juan Cebiata, who asked the Spanish to assist them in defeating the Apache, excuse me, and accompany them to their lands in West Texas. The expedition took the Spanish down the Rio Grande from El Paso to the San Saba River area, establishing the mission San Clemente. While there, Sabiadas Humano were able to hunt buffalo. They did all sorts of things to re-provision themselves, but the Spanish didn't stay at San Clemente for very long. They themselves killed about 4,000 buffalo in a very short time, and given how well provisioned they were, having killed 4,000 buffalo, they went back to El Paso and set up El Paso essentially as their base of operations. Now, next place, we're going to look at East Texas in contrast. Part of why the Spanish all but abandoned the Humano after establishing San Clemente was that the French activity in the Gulf Coast, in the eastern part of what is Texas, was starting to encroach on Spanish-controlled land. So essentially, the Spanish prioritized East Texas over West Texas. Starting in the 1670s, the French actively explored the present-day Midwest and Mississippi River valleys, as you can see on the map on the screen here. In 1682, an explorer named René Lassalle, he had a much longer name, but we don't need to worry about this. René Lassalle is all we need to worry about. Reached the end of the Mississippi River, okay, all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico. He reaches the end of the Mississippi River and declares that all lands drained by the Mississippi are now French possessions. Okay, now you can just kind of look at the map here and see that that would mean everything here in the Gulf of Mexico, if LaSalle is right, belongs to France. LaSalle's official plan, I want to make this distinguishing point. LaSalle's official plan was to set up a warm water port to support the French fur traders. Now, a number of historians reject this just out of hand. They say that may have been the official explanation, but that's not why he was trying to do all of this sort of stuff. What LaSalle was absolutely trying to do was set up a post that existed solely to capture Spanish ships that carried gold through the Gulf of Mexico. They would get gold in the southern parts of what is today Mexico and bring them up through the Gulf of Mexico, and France could actually attack these vessels. Now, while doing all of this, LaSalle took with him an expedition toward the Rio Grande with one of his ships wrecked, so he decided to abandon this quest and headed back north. Now, his goal was not to return to a temporary colony that he had set up. He set up a temporary colony in present-day Victoria County and used this as the base, again, to explore present-day Texas in the Matagorda Bay, excuse me. Now, he took with him this expedition. It falls apart, and he decided, rather than come up to his original colony, he says he's going to go to another place. He's going to head to another place in Fort St. Louis in present-day Illinois. Now, that's a big deal. He's got this place set up here in Texas to be his temporary base for exploration, but he fails and decides, well, I'm going to go to Fort St. Louis up here, again, in present-day Illinois. So it's, when I say this is kind of all over the place, it is kind of all over the place, okay? Now, as far as the people in this the Texas Fort St. Louis, what happened to them was actually pretty awful. He leaves this Fort St. Louis and starts heading up so he can go to Fort St. Louis up here. The plan is to hit the Nueces River and get into the Mississippi River and then all the way up here. However, his men decided enough of all of this stuff. LaSalle is out of control, and they killed him. They kill him right here, just short of basically present-day Corpus Christi. They kill him. And these guys wind up becoming a sort of similar expedition to the Cabeza de Vaca expedition. They wind up getting shipwrecked. They're lost. There are only 4 survivors. and they wind up making it back to Quebec 5 years after the fact, and then set home for France. But the people at Fort St. Louis in Texas, when LaSalle left, he took all of the supplies with him, and because he thought these guys can make it on their own, they're self-sufficient. The Karankawa in 1689 attacked Fort St. Louis in Texas, which by this point only had 23 people living there, and the Karankawa got there and basically killed everyone. So this is a complete disaster for the French in every way imaginable. While it's an absolute catastrophe, for the Spanish, it's also a wake-up call. It's a huge wake-up call here. The Spanish crown ordered new expeditions, particularly in the east, where the French had been. In the 1690s, Alfonso de Leon, Alonso de Leon, found the remains of LaSalle's colony, the St. Louis de Tejas, and finally made contact with the Cados, whom the Spanish actually referred to as the Great Kingdom of Tejas because of their supposed wealth via trade. In between 1686 and 1690, Spain sent Alonso de Leon northward on several expeditions. His last, in 1689, took him to the wiped out colony, and in 1690, the Spanish explored past this area and made greater contact with the Caddo. These Caddo consisted of about 10,000 people from a number of different, as the Spanish considered it, quote, a number of different tribes. The Hasinai, whom the Spanish referred to as Tejas, this was the Spanish rendition of the Hasinai word for friend. The Hasinai were part of this group that they found. Tribes hostile, or quote, tribes hostile to them, surrounded the Caddo, so they were constantly on the defensive. So the Caddo actually confidently welcomed the Spanish, as they saw them as potential allies and trading partners in all of this. The Spanish also had a surprise edge, one that I suppose the Caddo kind of didn't see coming, if you will. De Leon consciously carried the image of the Virgen de Guadalupe as he approached the Caddo. Since the Caddo kinship gender-based system held that women symbolized peaceful intent, which we covered in the last lecture, the Caddo were far more willing to accept the Spanish. The Caddo sent parties of men, women, and children out to greet the Spanish, then invited the visitors to their village, where the women brought out foodstuffs, exchanged it with the Spanish for garments, for blankets, for tobacco, all sorts of different goods. Now that they're there, and there's some basis for trust, the Caddo and the Spanish leaders set about their goals and their missions. The Caddos gave permission for De Leon and Friar Damian Massenet to set up two missions, one of which was the first mission actually created in Texas, San Francisco de los Tejas. The Spanish perception of the Caddos was that they held onto strong religious beliefs and that they had a concept of a single supreme being. Also, they discovered that the Caddo traded widely, including with Germanos, people who the Spanish were already familiar with. Since so many Indians seemed to be coming from such distances into the Caddo villages, the priests that accompanied De Leon had the idea that the Caddo kingdom, as they called it, or as they were calling it, was the ideal place for disseminating Christianity. There's a wide reach for the Caddos, so they can get Christianity out to everyone. The message would spread simultaneously with trade. Now, while all of this looked like a good start, the Caddo were neither willing converts nor were they particularly indulgent with the Spanish. The Spanish seriously misread Caddo religious beliefs and spiritual traditions. Also, this is pretty significant, the Spanish had also disrupted the Caddo way of life. As an example of this, the Spanish named a Spanish named one of their own, a guy named Domingo de Terán, as the governor of the province of Texas in 1691. Okay, so remember, you've got the king, you've got the viceroyalty of New Spain, and then you've got all of these governors at the provincial level. So the province of Texas, Domingo de Terán is the new governor of the province of Texas. In 1691, they do this, and Terán visited the Caddo, planning to establish a whole series of missions throughout Texas. And almost immediately, Terán's livestock herds trampled all over the Caddo farm settlements and ate the harvest. On top of this, the Spanish struggled to control soldiers who, to put it nicely, degraded the female Caddo. And then the missionaries violated protocol and began offending the Caddo's spiritual sensibilities. As all of this happens, the Caddo resentment started to grow and grow, and some of them retaliated, by attacking Spanish livestock herds. The Spanish authorities were somewhat smart in all of this. They sensed the hostility and started to pull back. And ultimately, they pulled back so much that they left only the missionaries to continue Christianizing. But that also turned out to be a mistake. Pulling back was a good idea. Leaving only the missionaries was the mistake. The Caddo had conventions for allowing and folding outsiders into their midst, but it involved marriage, something that was clearly not on the table for these Franciscan friars. Since they really couldn't convince the Caddo why this was not possible, it became tougher to convince the Caddo of their good intentions, and the whole mission idea, the whole plan, fell apart by 1693 when the Spanish left East Texas. So this is just disaster in terms of what the Spanish are trying. Now, while they do withdraw from East Texas initially, this is a temporary withdrawal, as push and pull factors led Spain to return to East Texas by the first decade of the 1700s. Father Francis Hidalgo, who had participated in earlier missionary work, decided he wanted to give it another shot. And at the same moment, in 1702, the French were trying to renew their activity along the Mississippi River to stop westward expansion by by the English. The Spanish were already alarmed by the French establishing themselves at places like Mobile Bay, but at Natchitoches in present-day West Louisiana, this settlement stuff caused a near panic. The French motivations to get into Texas were almost always trade related. In 1713, a French Canadian named Louis Huchereau de Saint Denis arrived at Natchitoches, determined to establish a trade among the Spanish. Saint Denis, along with a small detachment of French and Hasinais, headed into New Spain, arriving at San Juan Bautista on the Rio Grande in July of 1714. The person in charge there, a Captain Diego Ramon, arrested this invading, quote-unquote, French force almost immediately and waited for word from the viceroy of New Spain about what to do with these people. Now, he arrests them in July of 1714. The orders about what to do with Saint Denis and all of these other people doesn't arrive until early 1715. So they're imprisoned for months waiting word on what to do. The orders from the viceroyalty of New Spain was that the French were to be taken to Mexico City for a quote-unquote official interrogation by the Spanish government. Now, Saint Denis' account and the fallout, so to speak, was, to put it mildly, it was weird. Saint Denis produced a letter from Father Hidalgo saying that the Caddo desperately wanted continued missionary work and in particular wanted Hidalgo. So Hidalgo asked Saint Denis if he would help him out in this process. When it came to trade, Saint Denis affirmed that he understood that he was in Spanish territory, but he also said that he didn't think that there was a legal ban on trade by the French in Spanish territory, which frankly is virtually every historian thinks that this is nonsense, that he didn't know. He absolutely knew. Hearing all of this, Spanish officials said there's no justification for any French incursions into Spanish territory, and they ordered Captain Domingo Ramon, Diego Ramon's son, to turn Texas into a buffer zone between they and the French, between the Spanish and the French. Then the viceroy ordered that the second in command of this expedition, he says, okay, yeah, I approve of the expedition. The second in command of the expedition will be Saint Denis, which made no sense to almost anyone involved in all of this. Even especially given that the whole reason they're having to do all of this, the whole reason they're building a buffer zone in the first place is Saint Denis' invasion of this area. So Saint Denis apparently told the Spanish that he would set up shop on the Spanish side of the border and assist in Christianizing efforts, and this had a huge effect on their saying, okay, we trust you now. The viceroy it appears, did not entirely trust Saint Denis, but could not deny that Saint Denis' knowledge of the terrain and the Indian language was of critical importance. So he may not have trusted him all the way, but he trusted him enough because of all of this. He could clearly be an asset in rebuilding the relationship between the Spanish and the Caddo. It appears that the turning point in this relationship with Saint Denis was that Saint Denis, in the meantime, had fallen in love, and the person he fell in love with was Diego Ramon's granddaughter, and then he married her, so now they're all kind of interconnected via marriage. Now, courtesy of all of this, in 1716, in February of 1716, again, a Captain Domingo Ramon and Saint Denis crossed the Rio Grande, headed for East Texas with about 75 people. About a third of them were soldiers and a large number of Franciscan priests. Once they were in East Texas, the Caddo people received them, largely because of Saint Denis' presence, and consequently believed that the Spanish would abide by the Caddo custom of embracing kinship via marriage, something that the French had previously done. So since the French had done it and Saint Denis was French, the Caddo simply assumed, okay, well, now the Spanish are going to go along with the process. So they thought they'd embrace this kinship and thus would establish families in the villages. In June of 1716, the explorers set up a base near the Neches River, constructed a temporary presidio, and then decided they're going to build 4 new missions to go with these 2 new presidios. Now, with the new missions, the Spanish had succeeded in accomplishing 2 things. Number 1 was to revitalize the missionary work. That was a big part of what they're doing here. And secondly, they laid claim to the region, something the Spanish saw as critically important. They were now saying clearly this territory is Spanish territory. It is not French territory. Now, New Spain's government also sought to solidify their position on the northern periphery. In 1717, Domingo Ramon and Friar Antonio Margil de Jesus established 2 more missionaries further east of Natchitoches, pushing them close to French territory. There was real trouble in this venture. The first was the conditions in the region. The conditions were terrible, as soldiers and missionaries got very little help from the crown because basically they're in the middle of nowhere. The crown couldn't help them. So the Spanish government, even if they wanted to help these guys, really couldn't. So they got no food, they got no clothing and supplies coming in, no weapons coming in. Their other potential source of help was the Caddos, and they also gave very little help for a familiar reason. The Franciscan friars that they left behind again simply could not explain to the Caddos in a satisfactory way why they are in fact not marrying into the group and living in the villages, even though this had all happened before. It had happened once before, and the Caddos said, "Get out," and the Spanish come back, giving the impression they're going to do it. The Spanish did exactly the same thing again. So the Caddo simply gave them no help whatsoever. So again, another expedition is led. This one by Martin de Alarcon, who went from Mexico City toward the Rio San Antonio in 1718 to build a post. This new post is going to be San Antonio de Bejar, and a mission accompanying that post, that presidio. The mission is going to be San Antonio de Valero. The hope being, again, Christianize the Coahuiltecan Indians, who at that point were under attack by the Apaches, who were coming down from the Great Plains. The other plan with this Presidio mission complex between the Rio Grande and East Texas is that it would become a supply station, resulting in what would become the original municipality of San Antonio. Spain constructed the mission San Jose y San Miguel de Aguayo in 1720 and 3 more by the 1730s. Spain also built a fort, that gave them control of La Bahia, which they hoped would keep the French completely out of this region and serve as a temporary storage place for provisions that were brought into Texas via present-day Veracruz. By 1749, however, the crown ordered that both the Presidio and the mission of La Bahia to be moved inland toward the San Antonio River to the present-day site of Goliad. Now, while the towns did not thrive, the Presidio mission settlement did seem to thrive. So you can see on the map here the movement of all of this stuff. You've got San Antonio up here. You've got Goliad further inland. La Bahia is right here in the middle of all of this, of the water here. So all of this is the plan for Europeanizing what is to become Texas. Right. This is where we're going to stop, and we'll pick up with our next lecture in, I think, what is this going to be? Lecture number 4? I think it's lecture number 4. Maybe it's lecture number 3. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Just watch the next lecture. Talk to you soon.